Hi comrades, welcome back to Marxist Voice, the podcast of the Revolutionary Communist Party. The impasse of the capitalist system is creating a volatile situation in consciousness, with swings to the right but also swings to the left being prepared. This presents an incredible opportunity for Marxists to connect revolutionary ideas to the struggle, to explain why the fight for daily reforms must be attached to the fight to overthrow the system itself. So if you're listening to this podcast, you agree with the ideas and you're not yet a member of the RCP, then go to communist.red/join and help us in the fight for revolution.
So Saint-Domingue had been a French colony since 1695, and it had been built on the blood of the slave trade. And actually it was an integral part of the process of primitive capital accumulation that had strengthened the French bourgeois over the course of the 18th century and actually laid the basis for the revolutionary crisis in France that broke out there in 1789. Now, once slaves in the colony were disembarked, they'd be taken to markets where they were inspected like cattle. Once a buyer was found, they would be branded by their new owner, whilst an interpreter explained to them their new role on the plantation, and a priest instructed them in the tenets of Christianity. And the vast majority of them were sent to work on the sugar plantations, where they would be subjected to unrelenting labour. For 8 months of the year, slaves had to do 18 hours a day to extract the sugar from the plantation. And for the rest of the year, slaves were made to plant new sugar crops, having to dig ditches in an earth baked hard by the Caribbean sun. And what little time that the slaves were given to themselves was utilised to try and grow subsistence crops, because the provisions they were given by the masters were so meagre. Slaves were routinely whipped for the slightest of infractions, often simply for slowing down the pace of cultivation. And the depravity of the slave owners really knew no bounds at all. One form of execution was to place gunpowder in the anus of a slave and then light it until they exploded. And the slave owners clearly delighted in their ingenuity for cruelty, devising methods of torture that suspended slaves by their limbs for days on end, known as the hammock. And slave women were routinely raped on the plantations. It was a regime of calculated terror that reigned across the colony of Saint-Domingue, because it had the express purpose of turning once free men into obedient slaves. And the barbarism that flowed from the needs of the slave system itself, it was vital to it, and slavery could not have existed without it. And indeed, this was all the more important because the mortality rate was so high. Yellow fever would wipe out half of all new arrivals to the colony within a year. And what this created was the perverse situation in which this encouraged the slave owners to basically work their slaves as much as possible and provide them as little food as possible, because they basically drew the conclusion that it was far better to work them to death than have the fever claim them in the end anyways. And so consequently, slaves had to be imported just to maintain existing cultivation, let alone to allow for its expansion. And it was therefore necessary for a new wave each year to be beaten and brutalized into accepting their conditions of slavery. And this violence and degradation did serve to maintain slavery for a whole historic period, but it also built up an immense swell of anger and resentment. And it was not without reason that Mirabeau, a leading figure of the French Revolution in its early stages, would comment that the slave owners of Saint-Domingue slept at the foot of Vesuvius. But in 1789, prophetic warnings of Mirabeau aside, no one really anticipated what was about to take place. No one saw that within 15 years, Saint-Domingue would be the first independent black nation. Indeed, the slave system actually reached its zenith on the eve of the revolution. Capital flowed into the colony at an exceptional rate, so that from 1783 to 1789, production almost doubled. And the number of slaves imported a year from 1787 onwards exceeded 40,000. The Haitian Revolution is therefore a salient reminder that economic prosperity is not a guarantee against revolution. In fact, this newfound wealth and prosperity actually strengthened the confidence of the slavers who, as we shall see, actually initiated this revolutionary chaos. Now, the reason that economic prosperity was no guarantee of stability was made all the more the case because Saint-Domingue of 1789 was riven with deep class antagonisms that went beyond just slave and master. The class of white slave owners that dominated the colony actually had their own grievances. These Grand Blancs were angry at the prevailing mercantilist system that forced them to sell their sugar produce to France and to purchase all imports from it, known as the exclusive. And there also existed a class of mixed race slave owners, a layer that had grown immensely wealthy, but who were denied political rights. They weren't allowed to serve in the army or navy. They were barred from professions like medicine and the law. And therefore they wanted to achieve that kind of political emancipation. And another class were the poor whites, or petty blancs, who worked as kind of overseers and workers in the towns. And they detested the Grand Blancs for their wealth and as well as the free mixed race population, but they also detested the slaves, and their kind of position that they found themselves in was that they owed a prestige was held over the slaves, right? They wanted to maintain slavery for their own kind of racial dominance in their minds, and they were therefore pretty analogous to the kind of poor whites of the southern United States. Now, the colony then was a tinderbox, and each class had something to struggle for when the French Revolution broke out in 1789. Now, just as the aristocracy had opened the revolution in France by demanding the calling of the Estates General, only for it to annihilate them, it was the white slavers that began the upheaval in Saint-Domingue. The news of the storming of the Bastille arrived late in 1789, and the Grand Blanc plantation owners were the first to don the red cockade of the French Revolution. They saw in this revolution basically a chance to break the hated exclusive, and that the weakening of absolutism would give them a freer hand in the affairs of the colony. So they set about kind of creating a so-called kind of national guard out of the old colonial militia, and they demanded the calling of a colonial assembly, which was forthcoming in January 1790. The Petty Blancs saw this as their moment to lay blows against the Grand Blancs, but also particularly the propertied men of colour. They set about lynching any non-white who didn't vocally support the revolution taking place in France, seeing that this revolution as their chance to basically expropriate these mixed race proprietors. And the slaves whose labour sustained all others had not yet entered the revolution, but they observed these great events and were drawing their own conclusions. Meanwhile, in France, the bourgeois had hastened to consolidate their position, to assert their primacy in French society. They took aim at the old feudal order with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen that was promulgated in August 1789. Now, this document was all well and good for the conditions in France because it was a clear attack on aristocratic privilege. But in the colonies, it threatened to undermine the whole rotten order of things. The big bourgeois that dominated the constituent assembly in this period had absolutely no desire to give rights to free men of colour, and still less to abolish slavery. And as a result, in a decree of March 8, 1790, they proclaimed that the Constitution, and therefore the Declaration of the Rights of Man, would not apply to the colonies. But the bourgeois had basically always intended liberty and equality for it alone. It had never had the intention to extend these ideas to the masses in France or the colonies. Nevertheless, the bourgeois owed its position to the masses. It had been the masses that had stormed Bastille in France. It had been the masses that had kept the king's counter-revolution at bay time and again, and therefore they had to consciously deceive. As a result, the decree that they submitted and sent to the colonies was necessarily ambiguous because it proclaimed that it gave the vote to all persons 25 years of age who fulfilled certain property and residential qualifications. So it left the door open to this being interpreted as political rights for the mixed race proprietors back in Saint-Domingue. Now, back in the colony, there had been a temporary alliance which had been forged between the two wings of the ruling class, between the Grand Blancs and the mixed race slavers. And this was because the intervention of the Petty Blancs had basically terrified both, because these poor whites were making claims to property that shook the foundations of the system that guaranteed these two groups of slavers all of their wealth. And this fragile alliance, however, would soon crumble with the return of a figure called Vincent Auger, a leading mixed-race slave owner of Saint-Domingue, who meekly called upon the Colonial Assembly to implement the decree of March 8th and grant political rights for mixed-race plantation owners. Now, the Assembly, of course, refused, and Auger responded with an equally timid insurrection of just 300 free men of colour. The weakness of the movement basically flowed out of the narrowness of its interests, right? It was viewed as basically a kind of squabble between the rich by the masses. And of course it was. It was basically two wings of the ruling class duking it out. But that's vital, right? That's a really important development, that basically the ruling class was now decisively split. And crucially, this event also reverberated back into France as it dawned on the bourgeois that they couldn't neglect the colonial situation any longer. And the masses were mobilised in the spring of 1791 in response to the king's attempt to relocate away from Paris and organise counter-revolution from afar. At the same time, the news of the tragedy of Auger inspired outrage, and plays about it were performed all across Paris. And as a result, a new debate took place in the Constituent Assembly in April 1791. And this time, a very small concession was wrangled by the radicals of that assembly. The Constituent basically made it clear that no one could deprive the full rights of citizenship from anyone who was born of parents who were both free. What this translated to in reality was just political rights for just 400 of the mixed race proprietors in Saint-Domingue out of a total population of 30,000. So it was a tiny, tiny concession, yet it was a thunderbolt to this tinderbox that was the colony, because it immediately sparked outrage amongst the whites of Saint-Domingue, and it drove this permanent wedge even further between the white slavers and those who were people of colour. French troops who arrived in the colonies brought with them the radicalism of the revolution, kind of adding to this chaos. They embraced free men of colour and declared that the assembly had declared that all men were free and equal. And this provoked even further outrage from the whites. It was met by the whites basically with brutality, with hangings and lynchings right across the colony. And the 500,000 slaves of Saint-Domingue witnessed all of this disorder and had heard for 2 years all of these appeals to liberty, equality, and fraternity. And these appeals that had been advanced by the Petit Blancs and by the mixed race proprietors and even by the Grand Blancs and so on resonated profoundly with them because, you know, the slaves began to interpret what exactly liberty and equality meant for them. And it was only a matter of time before they entered the fray and transformed the world in the process. Now, the great slave plantations of the northern province concentrated hundreds of slaves in a way that at the time, not even the dark satanic mills of Britain did so. One plantation had 1,400 slaves on it, and for comparison, the largest slave plantation in the United States was just 1,200, and that was by 1860. So these were enormous complexes, right? Enormous concentrations of this labour. And these vast slave plantations, as a result of this concentration, thus laid the basis for a profound class consciousness amongst these slaves, quite in the same manner as large factories and workplaces under capitalism. However, there is an important qualification here, because whilst it did create a kind of class consciousness, an awareness of the collective strength and a collective need to fight collectively in a common interest and common goal, it did not produce the same kind of consciousness as a modern industrial proletariat, right? Because the slaves were not interested in collectivizing the ownership of the plantations. In fact, they wanted to basically break them up and become independent peasant proprietors, and that was actually had very important implications for the course of the struggle of the Haitian Revolution, as we'll come to see. But nevertheless, it did lay this basis for a very organised movement, and that's what's crucial. For months in 1791, slaves met to discuss the plans for the struggle against slavery, so it had a very organised character. On the night of August 22nd, 1791, thousands of slaves in the northern province gathered amidst the pouring rain and flashes of lightning, and under the leadership of an ex-slave called Boukman, they engaged in a ceremony partly inspired by voodoo, and Boukman proclaimed, "The God of the white man inspires him with crime, but our God calls upon us to do good works. Our God, who is good to us, orders us to revenge our wrongs. He will direct our arms and aid us. Throw away the symbol of the God of the whites, who has so often caused us to weep, and listen to the voice of liberty, which speaks in the hearts of us all." And on the following day, thousands of slaves swept across the plantations, setting them ablaze and taking their revenge on any slave master they could get their hands on. The volcano had erupted, and the rhetoric of the French Revolution had clearly found a profound echo in the miserable condition of the slave. And once this was awakened, no army on earth, as we'll come to see, could defeat the masses who had become conscious of their strength and determined to fight for freedom. And in scenes that were like the mirror image of the peasant uprisings that had engulfed France in 1789, the slaves struck at the source of their misery and set nearly the whole province alight. And the countryside, as a result, was completely controlled by them. They actually established a permanent camp. And it was at this point, kind of a month into this struggle, that the most brilliant of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution entered the struggle, Toussaint Louverture. He was an ex-slave who had been extremely fortunate that his previous master, had trained him to manage aspects of the plantation, taught him how to read, and given him access to Enlightenment literature, and consequently obtained the necessary skills and virtues that would make him an outstanding leader of this revolution. He was a man of the Enlightenment. He read the Abbe Raynal's treatise criticizing slavery, and he actually identified himself with the role of the black Spartacus that Raynal had predicted. And this Enlightenment influence enabled him to become an outstanding leader. He emulated European military strategy with his troops, and he rose to the tasks of political administration as though he'd been training for it all of his life. And he was shaped by the age he lived in, but he had a profound impact upon it. He thoroughly exposed the bourgeoisie's commitment to its revolutionary Enlightenment philosophy, but he would also himself fall victim to its limits, as we shall see. Now, by November 1791, the slave rebellion, though, had reached an impasse. The slaves were basically at this point incapable of capturing the cities. They didn't have the necessary resources, and their forces were beginning to whittle down from starvation and disease. At the same time, new commissioners from France had arrived with a fresh kind of batch of troops in September, with orders from the bourgeois that had so boldly proclaimed liberty and equality to violently crush the slave revolt. And the slave revolt was therefore faced with overwhelming odds. And having blazed a trail, these leaders had no prior reference on what to do next. As a result of this immense pressure, Toussaint and Boukman decided to capitulate and strike a rotten deal that would help lead the slaves back into captivity for the freedom of just 400 leaders. Now, this was actually a crucial moment in the struggle, because it was quite possible that the slave revolution could have been brought to an end at this moment, at least for the time being. Yet the reaction revealed that it was completely unwilling to compromise, and as a result, guaranteed its own destruction. There's a clear parallel between the colonial administration's behaviour and that of Louis XVI in France. In both cases, the revolution was trying to arrive at a compromise with reaction. In Saint-Domingue, it came in the form of a capitulation and a mere amnesty for just 400 leaders. But in France, it was the bourgeois National Assembly, basically having won these modest reforms, desperately trying to compromise and with the king and have him just recognise the new constitution that still left him with most of his power. But in both cases, the path of compromise was denied not by the revolution, but by reaction. And the reason for this is that when faced with revolutionary pressure, it became clear to the reaction that any compromise now only opens the door for the ultimate downfall of these institutions. So in Saint-Domingue, the amnestying of 400 slaves would have been to admit that some slaves had the right to, could win rights through an insurrection, basically. So to have granted that and to have admitted that would have meant the ultimate downfall of slavery. For Louis XVI, he recognised that the downfall of absolutism in the constitutionalism of the revolution, his divine right to rule, would receive a fatal blow if he were to tolerate such a constitution. And so this is why the reaction was intransigent, but in being so it helped propel both revolutions forward. And so faced with annihilation, basically, the great slogan of the Haitian Revolution would emerge: liberty or death. And the revolt became a guerrilla struggle and continued to wreak havoc on the colony. In the meantime, a major uprising of mixed-race people had broken out around Port-au-Prince in the western province. Refusal of the colonial assembly to carry out the meagre promise of political rights for just 400 people, along with repeated pogroms on the part of the Petits Blancs, were what sparked this insurrection. Once again, it was events that took place in France that would decisively transform things in Saint-Domingue. The Legislative Assembly had come to be dominated now by the very maritime bourgeois who profited so greatly from the slave trade, the Girondins. And they were alarmed by the slave revolt. They saw in it the potential for the ruin of their profits, basically. But what they differed from the previous position of the bourgeois, and that they believed that the best way to guarantee the slave system was to basically arrive at a compromise with the mixed race slavers themselves. And so they made impassioned pleas about the universality of the rights of man, and one vote securing to all free men of colour the rights of full citizenship was a decree on April 4th, 1792. And with that decision taken by the Assembly, they therefore decided to send a new batch of thousands of French soldiers, along with two key commissioners, Sonfanax and Polverel, who would play a decisive role, with these thousands of troops having the dual mission of enforcing this new decree on the one hand, but crushing the slave revolt on the other. Now, far more decisive for the course of the Haitian Revolution, actually, was that there was another decision taken by the Girondins, which was to wage a war against reactionary Europe. And on April 20th, they declared war on Austria, beginning the French Revolutionary Wars. Now, these wars served to rapidly radicalize the French Revolution because they brought the threat of counter-revolution over the heads of the masses in the form of the armies of Austria and Prussia and so on. And as a result, by August, and this was actually intensified by the fact that the reaction within France was undermining this military struggle and leading France to a defeat. And as a result, by August, this basically reached a fever pitch amongst the Parisian masses, who stormed the Tuileries and placed the king in custody, demanding new elections on universal suffrage. In January 1793, Louis was executed, to the outrage of all of Europe, bringing Spain and Britain into the war. And this, of course, had dramatic consequences for the Haitian Revolution, because Saint-Domingue was flanked on the west by British-held Jamaica and to the east by Spanish Saint-Domingue. And so the slave revolt would now become entangled with the imperialist efforts of Britain and Spain. And just at the moment, therefore, that General Laval of the French had won a series of battles against the slave revolt, the expansion of this revolutionary war transformed things. For their own cynical reasons, the Spanish crown promised emancipation to any slave who would fight for them. And as a result, all of the leaders of the slave revolt brought themselves over to the Spanish crown. Toussaint Louverture had absolutely no illusions in the Spanish. He was interested in one thing, which was the fact that they could provide him with arms and ammunition. And as a result, he scored a string of magnificent military victories against the French, giving him control of the entirety of the northern province. In the meantime, the British invaded with the aim of grabbing this highly profitable colony for themselves. And the slave owners actually greeted this British invasion with immense enthusiasm, and this was basically the case because the British had this disastrous policy of wherever they went, they restored slavery on the island. Now, one thing that this left the French in an extremely precarious position, and their backs were basically against the wall. In a kind of desperate attempt to undermine the Spanish and British invasions, Sonfanax made the call to abolish slavery on August 29, 1793. And this was begrudgingly assented to by his fellow commissioner Polverel about a month later. And it was the first movement by the French Revolution itself towards the abolition of slavery. But it was insufficient to actually win any of the slave generals over, because for the simple reason that they didn't trust it, right? They could see that it was just a desperate gamble by two men who were on the edge of a cliff. And so the situation would once again actually be transformed by the intervention of the French masses. The French Convention that had been elected on universal suffrage was under the influence of these propertyless sans-culotte masses, and because of their propertyless position, they identified with the slaves and despised the slave owners. In the words of Page, an agent of the colonists in Saint-Domingue, "One spirit alone reigns here. It is horror of slavery and enthusiasm for liberty. It is a frenzy which wins all heads and grows every day." And it was the oppressed masses of France who became the only reliable ally of the slaves of Saint-Domingue. And it was their pressure that led the National Convention on the 4th of February 1794 to abolish slavery. And this was another example of the truth that the oppressed can only rely on each other, only depend on the strength of one another in order to win a struggle. And that it is perfectly possible for workers who don't suffer a particular oppression to fight resolutely to end it. And this is especially the case in a revolutionary situation in which the consciousness of the masses is being transformed at an extraordinary rate. Now the abolition of slavery was not just this a gamble by two rogue commissioners, but it was now the stated policy of the French Republic. And by May, the news of the convention's declaration abolishing slavery had made its way to Saint-Domingue. And this is what convinced Louverture to bring his forces over to the side of the French, decisively altering the situation once more. The slave rebellion and the French Revolution were, for the first time, fighting side by side, and they were now identifiable with each other. And just as quickly and spectacularly as he had captured towns for the Spanish, Toussaint now recaptured them for the French. And it is a remarkable fact that in 1795, French control of Saint-Domingue was guaranteed to them by the former slaves that the French had so mercilessly exploited less than a decade ago. The French Revolution had turned the world upside down. And the British, at the same time, had believed that the capture of Saint-Domingue would be routine, a very simple operation to simply nab a colony that was in crisis, and that would enrich the British treasury with the proceeds of slavery. Yet by 1797, the British had spent the equivalent of £700 million and had lost 80,000 soldiers, more than the United States lost in the entire Vietnam War. And it is true that yellow fever played a significant role in whittling down the forces of the British, but to leave that as the explanation is frankly untrue, because such claims are made because the imperialists and their apologists are not prepared to admit that they can be bested by the masses, and that in fact the masses and the oppressed can organize, fight, and win. Now, in January 1798, Louverture won 7 battles in 7 days, effectively ending lingering British hope that they could obtain anything. And the liberated black masses of Saint-Domingue had defeated the most powerful colonizer on earth. Their victory can only be understood by appreciating that wars are not technical questions. They're certainly not simply technical questions. That in fact, the determination of the slaves to fight for their own emancipation was an enormous factor, and indeed an unstoppable force, whilst British troops simply didn't understand why they were there in the first place. And the same dynamics would play out in just a few years' time when the French Republic went from being the guarantor of liberty to the guarantor of slavery. Now, whilst all of these events had been occurring in Saint-Domingue, whilst forces there had been waging this implacable struggle against Anglo-Spanish invasion, the revolution in France had gone into an ebb. The Jacobins had been overthrown, and the National Convention had been replaced by the Directory, a kind of thoroughly rotten bourgeois institution. The Directory was the bourgeoisie's first attempt to try and regain control of the situation in France after the intervention of the masses in August 1793. And this Directory dispatched a new governor, the Comte de Hauteville, a monarchist, with the mission of undermining Toussaint Louverture. And he did this by arriving in April 1798 and immediately deployed a policy of divide and rule, where he favoured generals like Rigaud and Pétion, who were generals that came from the mixed race group of proprietors on the colony. And despite Louverture having been made general-in-chief in the colony, Hauteville absolved Rigaud of his authority and encouraged him to administer the southern province independently. And even though Toussaint was able to expel Hauteville from the island, the damage was done, and Rigaud actually began an insurrection against Louverture. French plans to unseat Toussaint failed, however, as this insurrection was crushed, and therefore, by this point, Toussaint Louverture had cemented his hold over Saint-Domingue. Rid of opponents in French Saint-Domingue, Louverture carried out a bold offensive to liberate the slaves of Spanish Saint-Domingue, and Spanish forces quickly crumbled, and in 1800, Toussaint Louverture was master of all Hispaniola, though all of this was in the name of the French Republic. In 1801, Toussaint Louverture proclaimed a new constitution for the island that named him as governor for life. And this constitution enshrined the abolition of slavery, but it also made direct provisions for the maintenance of an expansion of the plantation system as the bedrock of the colony's economy. Louverture's rule, therefore, was an excellent demonstration of the material limits of the bourgeois revolution. Slavery was abolished, but forced labor in the plantation system wasn't. White plantation owners were encouraged to return to the colony and take repossession of the property they had lost at the hands of the revolution, and were given guarantees that labour would be provided to them. And the link with France was prized above all, and Louverture was desperate to maintain it. Culture, which would actually be the fate of the Haitian Revolution following its independence. Now, as was the case in France, it was not possible for the revolution to pass into a socialist one. Thank you. Yet these material limits imposed upon the Haitian Revolution led to a profound resentment amongst many of the emancipated slaves who had taken the words of liberty and equality at their word. And this anger would explode in October 1801 with the nephew of Toussaint himself, Moïse Louverture, leading a revolt of 6,000 workers. And Toussaint dealt with this ruthlessly, executing Moïse. And it did not go unnoticed that Toussaint Louverture showed great mercy and clemency to a myriad group of slavers and so on across the colony, and yet had dealt with these ex-slaves with such brutal force. And it served to weaken and undermine him, just as an enormous challenge to the freedom of the former slaves loomed over the horizon. Because once again, events in France would determine the outcome of events in Saint-Domingue. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in a coup d'etat that made him first consul of the French Republic. He set out to achieve what the Directory had basically failed to do, which was to restore order so that the bourgeois could enjoy the fruits of the revolution. And he basically, what he wanted to do was he stripped the bourgeois of their political power in return for a guarantee of their private property. And of course, this private property included the slaves that had emancipated themselves in the colonies. And Napoleon therefore made it his mission to restore order and slavery across France's colonial empire. And Napoleon dispatched his brother-in-law, Leclerc, along with thousands of soldiers who arrived in the colony in February 1802. Toussaint had done very little to prepare for this moment. He had placed all of his faith in the French Republic that had abolished slavery. More than that, he couldn't really see past France. He couldn't see past this link with the French Republic, understanding this desperate need to maintain the plantation economy and the political and economic links with the metropole. And consequently, Leclerc was able to kind of disembark most of his troops, despite a standoff with a black general, Henri Christophe, a future emperor of Haiti, in Le Cap. And once it became clear to Toussaint what was happening, he called for his army to wage a campaign of scorched earth and undermined all of his efforts to restoring the plantation system across the island. And the island was set ablaze as the Haitians withdrew to the plains around a town called Genève. And in a career littered with military triumphs, Louverture was able to pull off his most brilliant maneuver when faced with this basically disastrous situation. With French troops closing in on all sides, his army was able to launch an offensive that broke through their lines and allowed his army to escape mostly intact. Part of his army was then trusted to the ex-slave general Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who defended the fort of Crête-et-Pierrot in the face of overwhelming odds. The Haitians displayed that an army of ex-slaves were once again more than a match for Europe's finest troops. And it was here in this fort, for the first time, one of the leaders of the slaves spoke of independence. Dessalines understood better than Louverture that to end slavery would mean to end colonialism, to fight for independence. And he declared, "I shall make you independent. There will be no more whites among us." This was the battle cry of that defiant struggle. And just as Louverture, however, was turning the situation around, his political weakness would undermine the struggle. His continued reluctance to break with the French, who were determined to crush him and the slave revolution he had guided, undermined the morale of his forces. His army was beset by defections as the French cunningly made false promises to them that slavery would never be restored, that those generals who fought for Leclerc would retain their positions. And despite this, in April 1802, Louverture actually had the advantage. His troops were poised to sweep down the plains and go on the offensive. But Louverture still laboured under the illusion that he could come to terms with France. He sent Henri Christophe to entreat with Leclerc, but the result was his defection to the French, and it was a crushing blow for the Haitians. Christophe's defection basically reversed the situation again, and it compelled Toussaint to make the same kind of humiliating deal with Leclerc. For a brief time, Toussaint was allowed to live on his own plantation, but it wasn't long before he was tricked into a meeting with French military officers, captured and then deported to France. And there, in a jail near the Swiss border, Toussaint Louverture, who had led a slave rebellion that had conquered the armies of Britain and Spain, died from maltreatment and undernourishment. It was an ignominious end for such a remarkable revolutionary. And in May 1802, Napoleon must have believed that he'd reconquered this most precious jewel of the French Americas, yet the masses would have their final say. Peace and stability did not last long in Saint-Domingue. In July, General Richempanse, the man tasked with restoring bourgeois order to Guadeloupe, announced the restoration of slavery. Napoleon had showed his hand too early. As news of restoration spread to Saint-Domingue, enraged by this and the deportation of Toussaint, across the island the masses rose up. As soon as one insurrection was put down, another would emerge. And the black workers were basically utilising the methods of guerrilla struggle taught to them by the preceding 10 years of warfare and chaos that had been inflicted upon the island. And yet, whilst all of this was going on, for months, the black generals that had led the revolution were loyally and faithfully carrying out the orders of the French administration and putting down these insurrections. But all the while they were biding their time, basically, or particularly certain layers of them were. And Dessalines was in communication with a general called Pétion, a mixed race general, another future leader of a free Haiti. And by October, these two generals once again defected with their troops and waged a relentless struggle against the French. Now, this final war became a war of extermination, with both sides drawing the conclusion that, they would have to annihilate the other. But what this doesn't mean is that somehow the violence that both sides utilised was some sort of equivalent. The violence that the slave uses to free himself from slavery is not the same as the violence that the slave master uses to keep the slave in bondage. They cannot be compared. Yes, it is true that Dessalines inflicted atrocities against the white colonists of Saint-Domingue, but he could not be matched by the violence and brutality of the French colonists. And the violence and cruelty of Leclerc and his successor, Rochambeau, was absolutely ferocious. In Le Cap, Rochambeau drowned so many people in the harbour that the town refused to eat fish for months. In perverse ceremonies, well-to-do white women of the town dressed resplendently to watch captured black workers tied to posts have their bellies cut and then dogs eat their entrails as they were still alive. That was the kind of cruelty that the white colonists were prepared to inflict upon the slaves. And the cruelty of the ruling class, when its power and privilege is threatened, knows no bounds. The reason their violence and barbarism is unparalleled flows directly from their role as an oppressor. To ruthlessly exploit and inflict physical and moral degradation on another people in order to benefit yourself requires a psychology of dehumanization. The ruling class believes that those that they exploit are inferior. So when the exploited rise up, they are met with the utmost contempt. You only have to look at events in Palestine to see how this plays out today. Now, this barbarism on the part of the French did not cow the Haitians. Indeed, it hardened their resolve to once and for all drive the French from the island. The year 1803 witnessed the gradual reconquest of the island by Haitian forces, despite thousands of soldiers being poured in by Napoleon. And by November, the French had been reduced to holding on to Le Cap in the northern province. On the 16th, Haitian forces concentrated for a final assault and displayed enormous courage as they advanced on the French guns and cannon. And despite the French holding off the offensive, they knew that the game was up. That night, Rochambeau held a council of war and determined to evacuate the island. The Haitian Revolution had triumphed. On January 1st, 1804, Dessalines proclaimed the independent state of Haiti. Now, when Napoleon Bonaparte came to power in France in 1799, he would succeed in securing virtually all the gains the bourgeois so desperately craved. They kept the property that they had expropriated from the church and the aristocracy, and the Code Napoleon established the perfect legal parameters for them to enjoy this property. Above all, he brought them order as the masses were driven back into subservience, at least for a time. Yet the one thing Napoleon could not deliver the bourgeois were their slaves and the profits of their labour. The Haitian masses thwarted his plans and proved to the world that the most downtrodden layers can defy imperialism when they are organised. And for this reason, the Haitian Revolution is an inspiration for everyone fighting for a world free of oppression, degradation and exploitation today. It was a terrifying precedent for the oppressors of the world that was feared by the slave owners, inspiring slaves to rise up in Jamaica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Grenada, Curacao and Venezuela, all in the year 1795 alone. And the inspiring example of Haiti had to therefore be undermined and transformed into a warning for the oppressed of the world. And as a result, Haiti was subject to a